Okay, welcome and thank you for appearing before us today. I declare open this public meeting or public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment Growth for the inquiry into Australia's transition to a green energy superpower. And in accordance with the committee's resolution of 7th of September 2022, this hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. So welcome. I now welcome the following witnesses to give evidence. Just for the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? If we could.
Thank you, Chair. So, David Woods, I am the Chief Economist and the First Assistant Secretary of the International Economics and Green Economy Division in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Thank you.
I'm Helen Stylianou, the First Assistant Secretary of the Trade Resilience and Indo-Pacific Economic Cooperation Division.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Juliana Nam. I'm the Assistant Secretary of FTA Policy and Economic Cooperation Branch of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Thank you.
Thanks.
And good afternoon, Chair. Michael Graudo, the Acting First Assistant Secretary of the Climate Diplomacy and Development Finance Division in DFAT.
Thank you. This hearing's legal proceedings of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a short opening statement, give us a bit of a brief, and then we'll open up for informal questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the committee for inviting us here today. We see this as being an important topic for both Australia's transition to net zero emissions, but also for ensuring our economic resilience and prosperity, particularly in the face of shifting global energy demand. And both of those, of course, are priorities for this government. We also see it as an opportunity for the department to provide an early statement on the topic and on our role as a department prior to providing our formal submission to the committee later this month. So the starting point for our thinking is the global commitment to the transition to net zero emissions. By our count, 140 countries have either committed to or are considering a commitment to net zero emissions. 97% of our exports by value are to countries that have a commitment to net zero. So in that context, we see that transitioning and diversifying our export base towards green energy exports will have four benefits. The first will be to present obviously significant economic opportunities for Australia. The second is to manage the economic risk associated with the carbon intensity of our current economic profile. So if you like, there's the opportunity and then there's managing the downside risk. But more than that, it provides, will represent a material contribution to global climate action and to the decarbonisation of our trading partners. And finally, that transition that we're describing would also support our strategic agenda in the Pacific. So we'd see it as having four key benefits. But it would also offer the observation that still very early days. Still very early days in terms of establishing the renewable energy trade. So firstly, our transition to being a green energy superpower will require a very significant scale up of our domestic renewable energy generation capacity to underpin then the growth of those green energy exports. So if I can just give you one metric to illustrate that pretty graphically. In 2021, our entire electricity system within Australia, and that's not just the NEM, but that would include the networks to the west and to the north, generated 956 petajoules of energy. By comparison, our coal and LNG exports in that same year represented 15,400 petajoules. So there's a scale, a magnitude difference between our domestic electricity system in terms of energy versus that which is represented in our energy exports. So lifting our renewable energy exports to be anything comparable to what of the energy content that we're currently exporting by way of LNG and coal will require, would see this as significant new levels of investment, including foreign investment. So we'll need to remain an attractive destination for foreign direct investment on a scale which is quite a level above and beyond anything we've seen previously, while obviously still doing that through, while protecting our national interests through the Foreign Investment Review Board and the work of Department of Home Affairs. So investment, kit. So we're going to need to access secure supply chains to deliver us the solar cells and the wind turbines at a time when, you know, those other 140 countries are doing much the same thing. So we know already about the difficulties with supply chains, shortages. So we've got a massive move by so many countries at the same time. So that's also a challenge. And then skills. So modelling by the Net Zero team out of the Melbourne University, it's a coalition of researchers, suggests we'll need up to 1.3 million new workers to reach net zero. So investment, the equipment, the skills. So very challenging. But the upside is that the technologies themselves, you know, solar and wind, I mean, we know they're already mature, they're already being deployed. And Australia also has, as we all know, experience and expertise in developing energy industries on a very tremendous scale. So that'd be the first observation. Second observation is around the technology in which, or the medium in which we then export that energy, that electricity once generated. How do we export that? And the technology by which we do that, by and large, is nascent and remains to be developed. And if I was to generalise wildly here, most of that technology won't be commercially viable and deployable until the back end of this decade. So in other words, we have to build a renewable energy system on a scale much larger than where we are today, magnitudes larger than where we are today. At that point, just conceptually, at least in sequence, we can then think about how we export it, whether we export it either as energy, directly as energy, through subsea cables, or by hydrogen or ammonia, or embodied in energy-intensive products such as green steel or green aluminium. And so the choice at that point between what the export mix looks like will ultimately be for the private sector, a choice for the private sector. And obviously that would reflect a calculation on their part about the relative cost of shipping the electricity through very expensive technologies such as freezing hydrogen at minus 262 degrees, or through the onshoring of industries such as aluminium and steel to be close to the point at which that electricity is being generated. But all those choices, whether you're talking green steel, green aluminium, hydrogen, still rely upon the development of new technologies. So again, a challenge, but again, a source of optimism would be the increasing level of investment by governments in the US and the European Union, Japan and Korea, who are all pouring very significant amount of resources into this space. which we would see as then accelerating the development and the commercialisation of technologies that Australia can then deploy, that Australia can then use. As we've done previously with technologies such as the LNG industry, which is technology developed offshore but then applied by Australia. And so thirdly, we will need to ensure that those Australian producers have access to markets. So energy policy, and you'll obviously be very deeply familiar with this, is increasingly treated as a matter of economic security. So this speaks to the role of government in maintaining strong relations with our trading partners, and also to the importance of our reputation as a reliable trading partner. So there were those three areas which I'd point to as where we need to address in order to build up our potential as a green energy superpower. So it's building the renewable electricity system, it's getting the technology right to then export that, and then it's also ensuring that we have access to the markets. And so if I can finish now, Chair, just with one reflection then about the role of DFAT amongst all this. So what I would point to is that DFAT, with its large network of posts and its relations with foreign governments, has a key role to play in providing the strategic and the foreign policy lens on international climate engagement more broadly, but particularly on this issue of the energy transition. So that would be the first. The second is that we would then be our role, particularly for those members here in front of you who are from the Trade and Investment Group, to identify and enhance those trade relationships and those trade arrangements to facilitate the key energy export flows, and obviously the import of the kit, either through leveraging the network of existing arrangements, the FTAs, the WTO, through bodies such as APEC, or through developing new arrangements such as the recently signed Green Economy Agreement with Singapore, or the work that's currently underway on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And all of which, I should mention, our development program, all of this then obviously complements the work that DFAT has in rolling our development program particularly into our near neighbours. So I might pause there, Chair. There's a fair bit to work with, but very obviously open to the questions from the committee.
Thank you. Thank you for your brief to us. I'm sure there's lots of questions, but we'll start off. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything or just jump in when we're asking questions. I might kick off before I hand over to the Deputy Chair. And you briefly touched on it, DFAT's role in attracting foreign investment. Are there actually any programs in place or campaigns to attract investment and capital to Australia for renewable energy exports, etc., at the moment?
So I'll start, and Mr. Leone might wish to add as well. So, Chair, I mean, today, of course, we're speaking with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I know that you have our colleagues from Austrade appearing on I think it's the 30th of November. So I guess the way I would think about answering your question is the respective roles of the two agencies. So from our perspective, from Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, our I guess core strength, if you like, is engaging with foreign governments, government to government. Clearly, in doing so, we engage with industry, with investors. But the core role for engaging with investors and attracting investment into Australia for whatever the sector would still be with Austrade. So I think that they will probably be better placed to speak to that when they appear to you on the 30th. But Mr. Leone might yet correct me on that.
Thank you very much. It's a really core part of our overseas presence to promote Australian industry and to support Australian business. We work very closely with Austrade at Post to support individual businesses, and we work with DISA as well, the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, to promote Australia as a supplier of renewable energy and to promote Australian businesses engaged in that supply chain. So that's part of our sort of trade promotion activity. It's captured as one of the particular sectors there. But there are other ways in which we're promoting it. You use the term program, Chair, but it's a program, I think in DFATs under the portfolio budget. The program is quite a big one. Trade and foreign policy is all captured by program policy priority number 1. So as part of that, we're also engaging in new types of trade negotiations to promote Australia as a supplier of renewable energy. For example, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations, where we have a specific focus, a whole pillar designed to support clean energy, to develop new standards. For the membership of that agreement, there are 14 members participating in that negotiation, which is just about to start. So it's very early days in that process. But those 14 participants have decided to have a particular focus on clean energy and to look at all of the elements related to clean energy, including standards that would be agreed to, that would be a basis on which to attract investment. Which goes very much to your question. We also work with Export Finance Australia there to provide policy recommendations to government about SMEs or Australian exporters who are participating in clean energy supply, as well as to other countries. So, for example, to Vietnam to support clean infrastructure development overseas. So there are a number of ways in which we are contributing to investment and export promotion, working with Austrade and the Department of Industry, Science and Resources. There, with industry in particular, we're working on critical minerals, the Critical Minerals Facilitation Office. And as you know, critical minerals are a key part of the renewable supply chain. And there, we are supporting some of the projects to be funded by Export Finance Australia. We provide the policy support to put recommendations to government to fund projects under the Critical Minerals Facility established by the government. We're also working on APEC. And in the context of APEC, just last week, leaders agreed to the Bangkok Goals, which set a number of standards which are designed to address the environmental challenges, including climate change, and goals, and in particular they're looking at goals for strengthening the capacity to adopt renewable energy and other clean and low emissions energy technologies, which would in turn lead to opportunities for Australia. So there are a few of the ways. There are others that I could talk to, but maybe that gives you a bit of a flavour.
And one last one that I have before I hand over to the Deputy Chair. Currently, at this present time, what are the key sectors in the green energy transition area currently attracting investment? Could you name 2 or 3 that are currently attracting?
Well, the big one, the big conversation is really around critical minerals right now. That's a very important part where Australia has a particular value add or a particular strength. I think it goes to one of your terms of reference.
Lithium would be one of them, I take it. Lithium would be one of them.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Lithium. Yep.
Yeah, lithium is.
Yeah.
And perhaps as well in that space too, but renewables across the board, because of Australia's potential solar, wind, offshore and onshore, and that there's a huge amount of interest in those areas. And as Helen and David have pointed out, the work we do with Austrade very closely on those things. But just by way of example, the big Spanish renewables company Iberdrola was here a few months back, you might have seen in the paper. They've already got a range of projects in Australia and are looking to invest more. And the trip by their global CEO was facilitated by DFAT and Austrade to come out, meets senior people here, does the tour, then goes back to Australia, and they meet to say where to next and that. So just as a sense of the crunchy practical end of it, DFAT and Austrade are working on both ends to make that, to facilitate greater investment from big European renewables investors or others.
Excellent. Thank you.
Can I just ask a follow-on question from that one, Chair?
Sorry, I've just got the Deputy Chair, then we'll come back.
Sure, you can
Yeah,
ask your
it's just a follow-on because I just want to understand the investment that the critical minerals is attracting is quite clear, but what's not clear to me is, are they looking to value add to the critical minerals in Australia, or are they just looking to access the minerals for export and manufacturing in their own countries?
So the idea, so the biggest project which has been approved under the Critical Minerals Facility is designed to take that project from being just about extracting the resource and exporting it to actually processing it to further down the supply chain. That supply chain is dominated by one particular global supplier, and that would give us, give Australia a foothold, if you like, into that supply chain. So it would be a value add, a development, a further development downstream in the processing field. If you are inviting the Department of Industry, the Critical Minerals Facilitation Office can talk to you quite a lot about that space.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to DFAT for appearing today, particularly the opening comments from Mr Woods as the Chief Economist. I appreciate the overview. I was particularly, and just for the benefit of the public gallery, with the sensitivity of the Senate at the moment, I want to take advantage of giving our senators the opportunity to ask some question in case the bells go. So I'll keep my line of questioning relatively short, then I'll throw to the senators in no particular order. You mentioned in your opening comment that there were four areas of that you were concentrating on, but particularly the second point after economic opportunity was managing the risk and the downside. Can you just expand on what the department sees as the potential risks moving forward?
Thank you, Deputy Chair. So I think the issue we have in mind there is that our export profile is emissions intensive. So we have, as you know, coal and LNG, two of our top three export earners. And so what we're very much alive to is that there will be a transition period, that those fuels will continue to be significant export earners for Australia. But as those 140 countries, or a significant proportion of them, follow through on their commitments to net zero, then clearly there's going to be a risk that the markets for those will be diminished. So this is not happening here and now, of course. We can look at global markets, energy markets, particularly in the context of the disruption coming out of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And we know that energy markets are stressed and tight, prices are high, and that flows through to our export earnings. But if we're looking over a multi-decade time frame, which is the sort of time frame that we would need to think about the development of the renewable energy industry to support the development of green energy, then it's reasonable to think that there's going to be some downside prospect to both of those. And the modelling that was released in November 2021 associated with the previous government's appearance in COP26, from memory, was looking at the making projections of the decline in both coal and then, to a lesser and later extent, LNG over the period of 2050.
Senator Canavan?
Thank you very much, Chair. Through you, Chair. Thank you very much for evidence today. Can I just ask, I'm sure you're aware that a large part of the renewable energy supply chain, especially critical minerals processing, is dominated by China. And a lot of that production is questionable in the extreme, especially that's conducted in Xinjiang province, and claims about potential, even just the extent of genocide there. I notice other countries like the US are taking action against Chinese solar panels, for example, that come from these regions. Is there anything that the Australian government is doing at the moment to impose higher ethical standards on where we get our renewable energy products from and how they're produced?
I guess, Senator, the negotiations like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which I spoke about, were you in the room when I started?
No, sorry.
sorry.
Yeah, division, sorry, but I might have missed that.
That's all right, but just to say that those types of negotiations are looking to set standards in the clean energy space. And that's looking at what constitutes the right standard in any particular space in clean energy that the members of that negotiation agree to discuss would be the type of, go to the types of things that you're talking about there.
But I presume, even today, I'd imagine that there's got to be some laws in this country against products that use slave labour. We passed laws through this place that are anti-slavery. Are we using those laws to try and investigate the ethical standards involved in the production of renewable energy?
So we have, there is an area in our department which is not represented here at this table that is dealing with that.
Could you take that on notice then about what's happening there? I notice also, just more broadly, turning away from the ethical standards per se, I see the International Energy Agency themselves have drawn attention to the risk of China dominating the supply chains in these products. Do you have some info? Have you done work yourselves? I think I mentioned someone, a chief economist or something here. Have you done work yourselves on that level of concentration? Do you have any information you can provide us for products like rare earths, cobalt, nickel, lithium, etc.?
So, Senator, I haven't, and my team hasn't. I think we had a reference earlier from Mr. Lianu to the Critical Minerals Facilitation Office in the Department of Industry, Science and Resources.
Just let me know. Sorry, you go.
Yeah.
Coordinating here.
Who would be the agency would have the lead on that, and probably I'd direct those questions to them.
Right. Okay. So, as I missed the start, what do you guys do exactly in this space?
I think the essence of your question, right, Senator, goes to the dominance of the supply chain in critical minerals, and that's without going into the particular figures. There is no question about that there is a dominant supplier of critical minerals, and part of the rationale for establishing the Critical Minerals Facility was to fill a market gap there to allow Australia to value add further down the supply chain into the refining and processing of critical minerals.
Yeah, and I was very much involved with that when I was a Minister for Resources. Very important work. I think where I'm getting to here in the issue is that China clearly subsidises, putting aside, as I say, the ethical issues, they clearly provide significant government support to processors and producers in the clean energy space. And really, without countervailing, if you like, not to use the legal term, but without countervailing government support from other countries, we're just not going to be able to compete against Chinese products. We've seen that with Lynas in particular here in Australia. Without the Japanese government support, they would not have survived the Chinese anti-competitive behaviour that they've been subjected to. So what exactly are we doing to counter that? What are we doing to ensure that we provide a stable marketplace for nascent, fledgling renewable energy companies in Australia or companies involved in critical minerals so that they are protected from anti-competitive action, often illegal action, illegal under trade laws that occur from the Chinese government?
So the questions you're asking there are about the Australian industry regulation, which are not within this portfolio's responsibility. Right. But in terms of what this portfolio does...
But you're DFAT, aren't you?
Yes, we are.
Oh, right.
Yes.
Okay.
You're talking about regulation of the minerals industry, which would fall within.
But you're involved in trade
portfolio.
negotiations.
Yes, which is what I was about to say, Senator.
That we can take action under. Okay.
So as I mentioned at the outset, there are a number of ways in which DFAT supports companies, and
Right.
one of them is through our work with Export Finance Australia, which
Yeah.
helps...
Yeah, that's in your portfolio, isn't it? Export
That
Finance
is,
Australia.
yes,
Yep, right,
yes.
okay, that's key, yep.
That's right.
Yep, right. So,
So-
where's the Critical Minerals
I think
Facilitation
if
Office
we
now?
just allow
Yeah,
Mr.
okay.
Nunu to answer
All right,
the question.
okay.
And
So we provide the policy support for Export Finance Australia,
Yep.
which funds small and medium-sized enterprises who wish to export. And as you are well aware, through the Critical Minerals Facility, we provide advice to government about projects that fall within the purview of the Critical
Right.
Minerals Facility. And that's about allowing Australia to, as you
Yep.
well know, I think, to contribute further down the supply chain in critical minerals. We're a great producer of raw product, but in terms of providing processed product to contribute to supply chains, for which there is great demand, particularly as a result of the renewable energy sector and the role that critical minerals play there, we have an additional role, a value add that we could provide to global supply chains to help address, but we will never, I think I can say, we will never actually be able to dominate the market in the way that it's currently dominated.
So,
by one supplier.
just in terms of Export Finance Australia, how many loans have we provided through EFA to businesses operating in the critical minerals space?
So under the Critical Minerals Facility, there have been 3 projects approved so far.
I'm
But-
not going over territory that's already been discussed. Okay, sorry, I just didn't want to be repetitive. I wasn't here earlier, so yep, go for it.
No, but there are, those are the ones that draw on the Critical Minerals
Yep.
Facility specifically. Of course, Export Finance.
Department coming in next week to brief us,
Okay.
which we could direct some of these questions.
All right,
So
let's
at that
save it
point,
for them.
I think I'll go over to
So can I
Senator
just-
Helen Polly,
can I
so
just
we can
have
share
one
some of the
thing?
questions around.
Sorry, Chair, could I just have one thing?
Yes, certainly.
So, if I can just add one thing. So, what we're describing here obviously relates to the critical minerals. I think the other point that you're also pushing towards is, or asking about, is more broadly about some of the kit and equipment that might be developed to support that transition, and the extent to which we're confident that we're going to have the supply chains that are resilient and that aren't that are competitive, that are not subject or hostage to any one country. So what I would also say is that the Department of Climate Change, Energy Efficiency and Water are probably the other key department that you'd want to have a conversation with. They do have the responsibility for leading the policy around our transition towards net zero, and that would include looking at the supply chains and very much addressing the set of issues that you're asking about.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And we do have Export Finance Australia coming in next week to brief us, so some of these questions will be directed to
Easy.
them. Senator Polly.
Yes, thank you. Unfortunately, I have to go again soon. But what I wanted to know is, do you maintain a data of our competitive countries in terms of green energy and in terms of hydrogen? I was recently in Canada and they seem to be on the ball, and there's a lot of European countries that are tapping into their opportunities, and I just wondered what sort of data and information that you can provide to the committee in terms of our main competitors and who their customers are as well.
So, Senator, I'll have a stab at trying to answer that. It's a good question. I'm not sure I'll have a really good answer. The department, again, it might sound like a broken record, but the Department of Climate Change, Energy Efficiency and Water are putting quite a bit of attention into the tech partnerships that they have with a range of countries to help support the development of the technology here in Australia, and part of that would then know which countries have the technology and which countries are well placed to partner with. I'd say that they would be in a better position to have the authoritative answer. What I would also add, though, is that if you look at the number of the studies which are out there in the public domain, and that includes, I mentioned some of the work that has been chaired by the University of Melbourne, scoped out the different countries and the different technologies where countries might have a competitive advantage or a different cost advantage. So you mentioned Canada, for example, is known to be a country which has relatively cheap gas and therefore relatively well placed to produce blue hydrogen, but its renewables make it less well placed for green hydrogen. If we come back to thinking about green energy, which is to the topic of this inquiry, I think most of those studies would be pointing towards particularly countries such as Saudi Arabia and Chile as being the countries which, if we're thinking through the mindset of which other countries might be out there competing with us ultimately for supplying green energy into the Asian markets, they're the two countries which appear most frequently in the reports as being probably best placed for competing with us, given their potential for renewable energy generation.
Thank you, Chair.
I might go to Jerome.
I have to go.
Okay, great. Thanks for the inquiry. Obviously, there's a lot of conversation about hydrogen and the export potential. And I understand that a lot of our trade deals are in relation to clean hydrogen. That's specified. But it doesn't specify whether that the hydrogen is produced with renewables or fossil fuels. From your perspective, do you think it's a risk to Australia's transition to a green energy superpower if we are exporting ammonia or hydrogen that is made with fossil fuels?
So thank you for the question. I think it's probably, to my earlier point, this is still really early days. Globally, there is no trade in green hydrogen at the moment, and global trade in hydrogen of any colour is pretty much next to zero. We've had a number of experimental shipments out of Victoria up to Tokyo, up to Japan, which have more or less about proving the concept, but the actual trade so far remains still something of a distant prospect, and most of the authorities that I'm talking to or reading will be again talking towards the back end of this decade before green hydrogen becomes something which is potentially commercially viable for shipment. So to your question, are the sort of the deals that you're reading about in the media prejudicing the future outcome of that? I wouldn't say so. The second point I would make, because it's still so early, that I think most of those deals, without actually knowing the content of them, I suspect are more about agreements to cooperate and talk with each other than actual deals to transact, to buy and to sell. The second point I would make again would be that the Department of Climate Change, Energy Efficiency and Water are closely involved in the development of standards, IPEH, and I'm not going to struggle to remember what that acronym stands for, but it is an international coalition which is designed to try and reach some common standards around the trade in hydrogen and around the trade in electrolysers to support the production of that hydrogen.
Okay, but could we even call ourselves a green energy superpower if we export dirty hydrogen or dirty ammonia? Like, is that a possibility, or is it just, would we call ourselves that if it was just hydrogen, just ammonia, or is that even, I know it's early days, but is there any point exporting the dirty stuff? I'm just interested.
Raise a slight point of it. We are questioning officials, so normally, I don't know what the House practice is, normally the Senate, we wouldn't ask the officials for opinions. And I know you could probably phrase that as a definitional question, but I just making sure the public servants aren't required to speak on matters of opinion for policy reasons. But yep, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator. So I guess my response will be to say it is still early days. What you're putting forward is a hypothetical, and I guess it's one that I would see to be relatively unlikely scenario. I could be wrong, but the reason I'd say it'd be unlikely is because the cost premium still that's associated with hydrogen is such that it would invite the question as to why the importer would be seeking to buy a fossil fuel derived hydrogen when the fossil fuel itself is going to be available on the market at a much cheaper price.
Okay, thank you. Senator Coleman.
Thanks, Chair. Just going back to some of the things that Senator Canavan was exploring. In the trade negotiations that we're doing at the moment, obviously EU's a fairly prominent one, and you've mentioned some of the other conversations we're having locally in the Pacific. What sort of role or is ensuring access and some of the protections that Senator Canavan was talking about, access to markets, are being included in those trade negotiations? Obviously pretty critical, and Senator Canavan did mention that the role that the Japanese have played with respect to the support of liners. So, making sure that we have secure access but good agreements and arrangements, I would have thought would be pretty critical in this. And so again, with these trade negotiations that we're currently having, what role are these things playing in that process?
Could I just add to the question, to Senator Colbeck's question? For example, in the US and I believe in Canada, firms that are working on hydrogen, renewables, etc., to export are getting up to, on top of their tax rebates that they get for investing in renewables, there's an extra 30%, which makes it very uneven, I suppose, when we're working on it as well. I don't know if you're aware
Perhaps
of that.
That's an extra question, but
yeah, sorry. I'm sorry. I'll hand back over to you, Senator.
He's the chair, he can do what he likes.
And I might not get to listen to the answer. Yeah, go.
Oh, sure. Look, if I may start off by answering that question in general terms about what a free trade agreement can do. Certainly, agreements can help reduce or eliminate barriers to trade.
The Senator's going to have to go,
Yeah,
so
sure.
if you can get an answer to him in sort of under 60 seconds, because he's going to need 3 of them to
Look,
move.
what I'll say is, look, ultimately these trade agreements seek to reduce those barriers, whether they exist today or in the future. And what it also tries to do is create a welcoming stance towards investment. Mr. Woods have already referred to the huge capital that we'll need to scale up a renewable energy capacity. And that's what I think a lot of these free trade agreements try to do. Certainly with the EU FTA negotiations that are underway, that is one of the key objectives for Australia, to order to attract the investment and the capital and the know-how into Australia so that we can develop with the European Union companies in particular these new areas for renewable energy purposes.
I promise to read the Hansard if there's any more. Yeah, one other question.
Yes, certainly.
I'm really interested in which key jurisdictions are very active in investment. So what are the key sources of investment in a jurisdictional sense? Internationally. Internationally, potentially into the Australian market. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Don't know whether you want to continue with that.
Sure. Look, I think we do look into the traditional barriers to trade, and ultimately that's what we are considering when it comes to bringing in technology into Australia, investment into Australia, and vice versa. And that's what free trade agreements seek to do. We look to reduce and eliminate tariffs, of course, as well as the behind-the-border barriers. But what we also seek to do in the newer trade agreements is more cooperative provisions on renewable energy, climate change action, as well as environmental factors. It is early days. FTAs, but we've got the platform in a number of these agreements to start that conversation. So, for instance, in 4 of our 16 FTAs in force, we do have specific provisions on such matters. For instance, in the Korea-Australia FTA, and we know the Koreans are very interested in hydrogen in Australia as well, we have the platform to facilitate and promote these areas for future cooperation, as well as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. We have a whole chapter on environment, including provisions on transition to a low-emission and resilient economy. And we've started conversations with the other CPTPP parties, including Canada, of course, and Mexico and Japan, in a number of these areas. Likewise, in the Australia-UK FTA, the legislation of which passed yesterday and hopefully will be brought into force soon, we do have specific provisions on cooperating on clean and renewable energy sources and supporting infrastructure and enabling technologies. And we know the UK is, of course, very interested in looking into Australia for some of these future needs as technology further develops.
Thank you.
Thank
Ms.
you.
Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. And I think I'll just probably go a little bit to where I think your question was leading. If I heard correctly before, Mr. Woods, you spoke to Senator Polley about, was it Chile? You said was a leader in green hydrogen?
Potential.
So, but not yet?
Not yet.
Not yet.
So there's no trade globally in green hydrogen anywhere in the world at the moment.
There's no production and no trade beyond sort of initial phase trials and that. It's not actually an industry as such yet.
So it's absolutely nascent. So what I was describing earlier is merely some studies by the various consultancies that are out there looking around at where is the potential, which is really a reflection on where are countries that have access to sunny days, strong winds, so high quality renewable, lots of relatively cheap land and relatively easy access into Asian markets. So it's on those sort of criteria that you hear of Chile, you hear of Saudi Arabia being bracketed with Australia as countries that are well placed to have the potential to serve into this market as and when the technology is developed.
Emerges. And so just to the sort of incentives then that you're seeing to attract investment, is it possible for you to provide some analysis that looks at what different governments around the world in perhaps some of those areas, particularly those countries that have the potential to become leaders that they're currently offering to attract investments, just so we can kind of get a measure as to where we are at by comparison?
So that's a question, great question, if I can take that on notice.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it'll be a comprehensive answer, I'm sure, so thank you.
Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. And back to your opening comments. I appreciate the intent when we talk about the multi-decade outlook, and I don't want to drill into granular details, but more so just unpack some of the assumptions in what that looks like. And if you haven't worked on it, that's fine. Did you say that our current usage here domestically is 956 petajoules, and the other figure of 15,400 is an additional amount that we export?
That's the energy content
Yep.
of our exports versus the energy content in our electricity system.
Which includes coal and
and
everything else.
Yeah. So have you? So and then you also mentioned about the amount of investment that's going to be needed into the future. But I think you pulled up at what that number potentially looked like.
I don't have a number with me. I mean, there's a lot of numbers that are out there in the public domain. I mean, they're all big and they're all scary, to be honest, in terms of.
By asking the first couple of questions,
Yeah.
will that number of investment, do you think, with the numbers that are out there, supersede the revenues that we get from our current exports? So into the future, as we transition to a green energy, and I'm making the assumption that we transition 100% out of fossil fuels. I'm not making the assumption that fossil fuel operators get their operations to net zero by
Offsets.
Offsets.
Yeah.
That is my assumption. will Australia, by transitioning to a green energy on the volumes that you've given against what the investment is going to be better or worse off, given that our two, and I know the colleague to your right mentioned emerging, in the multi-decades, we can't take that into consideration, but it must be at some stage. But just through solar and wind, are we better or worse off when referring to your opening comments?
Yeah, sure.
And if you haven't got it, that's fine. Just go and have a crack at it and come back.
Or if there's any studies that have been done.
Yeah, and if not, what do we have to do then? If the answer is, financially we're worse off, how do we turn that around? And are other countries in similar positions? Given that you would think as a country we would be a leader in exporting energy.
So if I can try to answer that question this way, which would be to say, the mobilisation of the resources that we're describing here on such a vast scale is way above and beyond what we could expect government to do, and not appropriate for government to do in most cases. So this is going to be very much an exercise that will have to be led and driven by the private sector, obviously with the right regulatory frameworks and the policy settings and so on, but it's going to have to be driven by the private sector, and the private sector forming a judgment on their own case, project by project, that the numbers stack up, that the revenues that they're going to generate are going to obviously meet the cost of the capital cost and the servicing cost. And so it's very hard to say here and now, or to do modelling about, what does that all look like? Particularly when we, to my earlier point about, first step is to get the renewable. I mean, I'm speaking conceptually, of course. It's not going to happen time-wise. It's all going to happen, sort of in parallel. But conceptually, you have to get your renewable energy system up to generate that green energy, and then the second thing will be to then convert that into a product which you can sell overseas. But what that product is and what the value around that product, it's really hard to say here and now, because, as I said, it could be by way of directly selling the energy. So that's what Suncable proposing to do with Singapore. It could be by green hydrogen as and when that becomes technically viable. Yeah. But it could be quite plausibly by saying, well, the cost of transportation are so formidable that it's going to make more economic sense to onshore a whole lot of activity, industrial activity, that's previously been done in overseas, steel making, aluminium making, because of proximity to the power.
Energy, yeah.
So there's a lot of moving parts there. So it's not. There's no modelling out there which is going to say it's where's your economic well-being scenario, base case scenario versus what I'm describing, because there's just too much moving parts. But I just come back to the point that ultimately this is going to have to be driven by the private sector making a judgment that there's coin in it for them.
Could you then, if the numbers are difficult, and I appreciate it was a broad question.
Yeah.
Can you then, with the data that we have, and I'm making the assumptions that solar and wind are the vessels that we move forward with.
Yeah.
Do a
Why would we make just that assumption? Do we want to limit them to that?
No. Well, that was because we hadn't identified what the emerging technologies were yet.
But
you can include hydrogen as well.
If there's any studies that have been done that the
Yeah.
department's aware about.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to work out how many solar panels and how many wind farms and are we going
right,
to?
I see.
And because you led me there with the abundance of land, the abundance of solar and the abundance of wind.
Yeah.
You pulled up at mentioning anything about hydrogen.
No.
investment.
So just to be clear, so first it's generating the electricity by renewables, so solar, and it will be at this stage we'd expect it's going to be solar or wind.
Yeah.
So then the question is, you've got that electricity, it's here in Australia, how do you sell it overseas? What's the medium by which you transport that energy overseas. And that's when you're talking about hydrogen or potentially ammonia or potentially green steel, green aluminium. But they're conceptually two different things, right? One is how you generate the electricity. And the second is what medium do you then transport that? And that's where the hydrogen piece is. But to your question about, in this grand scheme of things, what does that look like in terms of the amount of solar or wind? If I know that there's some projections out there. But I don't have them with me now. So if I can take that on notice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So,
And I'd just say too, I think because that's a domestic energy transition, that's very much the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. Yeah. They're the ones that work on that. DFAT's trade, international trade. So that if you're saying how many solar panels and how many wind farms, that's them.
Most of the solar panels are imported and they come through.
We might have to get them in as well.
Most of the solar panels are imported and the wind. So I was asking DFAT through the Foreign Investment and Trade that you have not through the clean energy.
I guess it'd be driven by the demand. Yeah. So we couldn't tell you how many need to be imported until we know how many are going to be used.
Well, we know what the usage is. That was mentioned in the opening comments. I was just working back from that assumption.
Yeah. What I'd say is that usage though, that's a theoretical petajoules figure. How many solar farms and wind farms that is to get to that is a domestic energy transition issue that's between us and the imports, I guess.
But we're certainly happy to take it on notice, but it might be a question which we then refer over to the Department of Climate Change, for exactly Mr. Growler's point.
But from a DFAT perspective, the export, the other part of it was the 15,400 which we export.
Yeah.
If this whole committee is about investigating what the green energy superpower is and exports part of that, I'm asking you, how many wind farms, how many solar farms do we have if we're not going to have fossil fuel to replace that? And I think that does sit with your remit.
Yeah, no,
absolutely.
We can take that on notice.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Lexler.
In regards to critical minerals, I don't know if you can't answer them. I know someone else is coming a little bit later. Does DFAT believe Australia would be at a competitive advantage if the rare earth and mineral refining that we are to bring here on shore, if that refining was powered by renewable energy?
That we would have a competitive
advantage in our trade and export deals. Like if we were to have a green refining, would that put us at a competitive advantage?
So I think we already have a competitive advantage in that we have these minerals that are quite rare by definition. So that's our first competitive advantage. Our second competitive advantage would be because we have higher environmental standards than other suppliers within the supply chain, including the dominant supplier. So therefore we have a second competitive advantage. That could hypothetically be a third competitive advantage. So it depends on the interests of the investor, and investors are interested in Australia's high standards. And I might just take that opportunity, if I may, to supplement what I said in response to Senator Canavan's earlier question. In the context of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, what we are doing there in the clean energy pillar is to negotiate standards which would lift the environmental standards and the recognition of a higher environmental standard in terms of producing these sorts of things.
Okay. Can I ask? Yep, no, all good.
I've got a very quick question as well. The in terms of the opportunities for Australia at the moment to diversify, following some of the global events that we're seeing, the Ukraine, some issues with China. What are we doing? We've had these disruption of the chain, COVID, etc. What are we actually doing to, I suppose, to pursue new markets, etc., or to ensure that we protect ourselves from these supply chains that we've found ourselves to be at the other end of after COVID? War in Ukraine and issues with China at the moment?
Yeah, I think, Senator, your question goes very much to what we discovered in the context of COVID and then compounded by the Ukraine war, is the risks of relying on one particular market or having all our eggs in one basket, as ministers have referred to it previously. As a result of that, what we have done is to initiate new trade negotiations like the IPEF, to focus on to leverage the existing free trade agreements that we have to identify new market opportunities. So, for example, some of the pressure that came about as a result of a lost barley market, we identified through the comprehensive the CPTPP agreement that there was an opportunity to use the tariff reduction with Mexico to export more barley to Mexico, for example. We're also working in our overseas markets to try to identify new opportunities and to liaise with our businesses. So we have a whole outreach program that we have been working very closely with Austrade on to ensure that businesses understand the risks of concentrating solely on one market, having all the eggs in one basket, and to understand what opportunities are available to them, what free trade agreements they could rely on, for example, as well as to understand the risks of the markets as we see it. So it's a bit of a two-way conversation that we've been having with businesses about sharing our understandings that we've gained through our overseas posts in particular, who have particular expertise in each of their markets, to inform business about the risks, the strategic risks of doing business in any particular market, and then to understand from business how they are responding, what their options are in terms of exporting to other markets. So there's a whole range of work that covers our geographic desks, our geographic posts, our free trade agreement negotiations, new types of negotiations like IPEF, but also the Green Economy Agreement that Mr Woods referred to, which is focused on a particular country and a particular type of trade where innovation is required. So there's a whole range of work that we're doing.
Thank you. I'll go to Senator Colbeck, who was interrupted by the bells earlier.
I just want to come back off Mr Buckholt's questions a moment ago. In the context of our competitiveness, which is going to obviously be a key element of our place in the markets, is there an energy price indicator that will apply to us in the context of how we can be competitive in the market? So where do our energy prices effectively need to be on a scale? Well, I mean, in a lot of circumstances, we're talking about energy conversion from one form to another. And so the cost of inputs, as it is in most of the rest of the economy, becomes critical in all of this, in terms of our competitiveness and therefore our place in the market, unless there are other parameters that we negotiate, as I was sort of inferring with my first round of questions before the bells went. So is there an energy price indicator that we have to be within to be competitive in this market, and has there been any work done on that?
Senator, there's certainly work in the context of thinking about green hydrogen, about the price point of production where it is now, and where it needs to get to in order to be competitive with other sources of energy. So that's not unique to Australia, but it's a sort of global point, reference point. Now, I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but certainly happy to come back to you with those on notice.
Yeah, because the energy export thing becomes really a matter of what form we're exporting. I mean, if we're exporting aluminium, you're exporting a lot of energy, effectively, because it's such a huge proportion of aluminium is energy, effectively, 70-odd%, I think.
That's right.
Is the number that comes to mind. And so in the terms of conversion rates, it becomes what's the most efficient use of the energy that we're...
So I guess at that point, so there are 2 points, right? One is to get the production of the generation of the energy down to a point where it's competitive with existing fuel sources. And then at that point is the question of how we transport it? How do we sell it on to global markets? So it's produced here in Australia, but obviously we're talking about something we want to export. And the question is, well, what's I'll use the word, the medium or the form in which it makes the most economic sense, commercial sense, in order to essentially get that electricity out of Australia and into Japan or Korea or wherever it might be. And so that's where, coming back to, sort of where we're sitting here and today in 2022, what we can see as possibilities would be, that subsea cable, that Sun Cable proposing to build up to Singapore, would be one. But that's only ever going to be a small part of our overall export mix. Hydrogen, but we know it's really difficult, but you could come back a level to ammonia, which is slightly easier to transport, but has greater conversion losses associated with that, so increasing the cost. Or you've got this electricity and you think about using it essentially by bringing the industrial process to the source. So the aluminium is one such example, and steel might be another. All of those, though, will depend on essentially decisions by the private sector. They will obviously be...
But the cost of energy is going to be critical to that, because
the cost of energy is going to be critical.
It's the
Totally.
key input.
Yeah, very much so. Absolutely. It's not going, obviously, it's going to be a range of other things which are going to feed into their decision. More broadly, operating costs within Australia, regulatory approvals, etc., etc. But cost of energy for something exactly like aluminium is going to be absolutely the beating heart of the decision.
So just going to the ammonia or hydrogen, the raw material for that is effectively, for hydrogen, is water.
Yeah.
Are there any thoughts around sources on that? We live on the driest continent on the planet, so effectively if we're exporting hydrogen, we're exporting our water.
Yeah.
And so, particularly fresh water, I should say, we're surrounded by salt water. But are any thoughts around how we might deal with that? Because if there's other competing uses, of course, agriculture being an obvious one, and so are there any thoughts around that and how we might manage some of those issues?
Yeah, so I've had the same question. I was speaking to some hydrogen proponents up in Brisbane a couple of months ago about the same issue, and so the amount of water that you will need for hydrogen is quite high. So you need, from memory of the numbers that they were telling me, you'd need at least roughly 10, 12 litres of water as feedstock for every litre of hydrogen. But then you're going to need a whole lot more water above and beyond that for cooling the electrolyzers. So it can work out to be anything, and again I'm just going off memory here from what I was hearing from them, anything up to around 30 litres of water per litre of hydrogen. So clearly, to your point, there's quickly going to hit a limitation within Australia about the availability of fresh water for that purpose.
Murray-Darling, for example, right at the moment for environmental purposes.
But
that's the point. Salt water is going to have to be the key to it.
But salt water is the key, and that's the way that they were talking about, would be to treat salt water and use it for that purpose. I did ask, what does that do for the cost curve? They were pretty comfortable that it didn't add significantly to their cost.
The cost of desalination.
Yeah, the cost of desalination.
Ms Lawrence.
Thank you.
And just before I go to Ms Lawrence, I'm conscious of the time as well, so I think this will be the last question unless there's something very pressing.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairs. Cognizant that we are a federation and each jurisdiction is doing its best also to attract investment and shore up business support. for the industries in each state and territory. And I'm just interested to understand where you see the opportunity federally to work and be aligned to the efforts of the states and in supporting business both domestically but also attracting that investment globally.
I'll have a kick off. I think it's something that we're very conscious of. Obviously, there's a rich history of over 120 years of federation, of not the best coordination between different levels of government. Something that we'll need to do better for this purpose. One of the things which would one of the partial response to that is the decision by the government to establish a new trade and investment ministerial committee. A committee which is chaired by the trade minister, but drawing on ministerial representatives from all the state and territories. That's partly been established more broadly, I think, to respond to an appetite by the states and territories to move on from a purely competitive model around attracting investment to recognising they can come at some cost to themselves, and there might be a role for coordination. So that's at a high level in terms of investment for all sectors, but certainly it's a structure that we see as being really quite promising for the purposes of what we're talking about here today. Not least because as we all know, a lot of the policy levers that are going to make these projects get up and run are all sitting in state government's hands or local government hands, particularly around land zoning and planning permits. There's obviously what we can do at a Commonwealth level, but we can't do that in isolation from the other levels of government.
Okay, well, it's encouraging that you feel that that's one vehicle that could well be a productive means to an end.
Yeah.
I think, at the bureaucratic level as well, ourselves and Austrade have similar sort of mechanisms sitting under the ministers in that way, but also, if memory serves, Minister Bowen has set up an Energy Ministers' Council, or re-established it, where he's recently been talking to his state and territory counterparts, because a lot, as David was saying, a lot of the...
crossover.
There's also, there's grants and there's permits and there's all manner of things happening at the state and the territory level, and they're really trying to coordinate those sort of issues as well to make sure they're pushing in the same direction. I mean, that's a long-running thing, not recent, but that in the energy sector in particular, which is what we're talking about here, that's certainly a big effort, knowing that the net zero transition requires that, but also a lot of the technology like hydrogen will as well. So.
And as a department, we have state and territory officers, and they work very closely with state and territory governments to understand policy development and to talk about things like our trade policy and trade negotiations and how we can reflect their interests in that context. So there is an ongoing conversation that happens very regularly as part of our core business.
Thank you. Just before I conclude the meeting, thank you for coming today and for giving us evidence. It's very good. You've been asked, I suppose, to provide a couple of questions on notice. It'd be great if you could get back to the Secretariat.
When do they come? When do we get those roughly? Do we
we can set a date, and from the Secretariat's recommendation, Friday the 16th of December.
Is that before we see them?
If we can get them earlier, it'd be great.
That'll help. You mentioned we can ask some of the other agencies coming before, but if we can get them before we see them.
The next public hearing we have next week is with Austrade and the Finance Australia as well. So it'd be great. I know that's it's only a week away, but if you could, it'd be great.
Actually, Austrade, I don't need that stuff I asked for the Austrade. I can ask independently. Mine maybe for the other agency that you mentioned.
The queue.
Maybe before I get in front of them. So just to take the workload off you, I'm conscious that
Yeah,
But
and
if you
I-
liaise with the Secretariat,
Yeah.
we'll be able to get them in at
sure.
a
Thank you.
convenient
It
time.
was
That'd
very
be great.
good.
Can I just say that you will be sent a copy of the transcript. If there's any changes that you don't agree with, let the Secretariat know. So there'll be an opportunity for corrections. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone, the gallery, the members that are here,
Yep.
Secretariat, and of course Hansard, who's been working busily behind us getting the transcript. So I declare the public hearing closed. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Chair. Thank you, Deputy Chair.
Well done.